Hi, my name is Chris White from ZeitgeistChallenge.com. I'm here to comment on a recent interview from Peter Joseph. He is the director of the movie Zeitgeist, and Acharya S, who he's interviewing, who was the consultant for part 1 of the movie. She was also cited over 31 times under different names by Zeitgeist for some of the most controversial claims of the movie. It comes out in the interview that Joseph asked Acharya to write a short ebook called the Real Zeitgeist Challenge to attempt to respond to the website that Frank Lordy and I have put up, called ZeitgeistChallenge.com. The book also directly quotes from me and a previous video that I did analyzing Acharya's first such response to critics asking her where she got her information that was used so prominently in the film Zeitgeist the Movie. And I will link that here in the description section. You will note that through this interview it appears that Joseph brought her on the show to answer word for word the challenge that is posted on the Zeitgeist Challenge website. It seems apparent that Joseph thought that she would have the answers to some of those questions. After all, she did claim these things to be true in her books, and Joseph has already endorsed Acharya's work to a generation of truth seekers with his movie. And you'll notice very quickly that the answers that she gives are not too convincing. So let's take a look at this discourse, and I want you all, no matter what side of the fence you are on, to listen to this discussion. This is supposed to be the answer to the critics. This is the big game. Acharya S, the consultant for the movie, and Peter Joseph, the director, are about to try to answer all the big questions that the debunkers have been asking. So keep an open mind and decide which one of us has a more compelling argument. Also, please note that I will be editing the audio slightly because of time constraint purposes, but I will not leave out any information that is vital or helpful in any way to their case, and I will link the full interview for your review in the description section. Okay, so let's get started. Here's our host, Peter Joseph and Acharya S.
As you know, debunkers will go after every tiny little thing without doing any research. I believe that's the game of debunkers, is semantic manipulation and fragmentation, from what I understand. I know that you've had your experience with that as well.
Well said. Yes, it's a never-ending game, and it seems to be a game with no rules except on their side.
Yeah, well, they're making the rules, evidently.
Yeah, changing the way we do research.
Yes, precisely. And when it comes to
acceptable.
Yes, and when it comes to well, also to fit their worldviews that many of them are emotionally inclined to protect, and that's of course one of the sensitive aspects with religion, as you so well know.
It would be illogical for me to suggest that I am not emotionally inclined in some way to protect my beliefs about religion. But I would suggest that both of these individuals are equally emotionally inclined to protect their beliefs about religion, and I would submit very much more so than me or any other Christian. After all, if they are wrong, the consequences are very dire, metaphysically speaking. Not so with me or any other Christian. In addition, both of these speakers' entire professional careers are tied up in their belief that Jesus wasn't real. I assume that they both make money off this idea and have quite a bit emotionally tied to it in that sense, the sense that their belief about religion puts resources on the table. You will hear assertion after assertion by these two that the other side aren't willing to believe them because of their emotions, but I want to make this very clear. I am only interested in what they say their proof for their claims in the movie Zeitgeist are. I have waited a very long time to hear them. I have offered money to anyone that can produce this evidence. So that's what I want, the evidence.
So what we can do today is begin to expand on a lot of these things that people hear, and they go to an encyclopedia and they say, wait a minute, it doesn't say that in my encyclopedia. And, I mean...
Encyclopedia surfing, I call it. Oh.
Yes, exactly. And that's the general nature of most debunkers these days anyway. So I'm looking right now at the Zeitgeist Challenge website, and I'm looking at all the claims that are made by the film that they say basically doesn't exist and they want proof of. So how do you want to do this? For one, I can just basically, Horus, for example. We have Horus born on December 25th, which most people don't seem to understand that we're talking about the winter solstice more than anything else. Would you expand on the birth of Horus? I think you can go in whatever direction you like as far as these points.
Sure. Let me explain a couple of things about how the historical process and scholarship work. First of all, not everything makes it into the dictionary or the encyclopedia. Okay? Sure. Encyclopedia surfing is completely inadequate. These things have been censored. These are talk about short digest.
Right.
I mean, this is just a few paragraphs on a subject, and they don't put in the stuff that's going to upset the status quo. Okay?
Yeah.
This stuff has been edited out. There was something called the Inquisition. Ever heard of it? They destroyed thousands and thousands of books for the very purpose that we're talking about now, that this information is not in those books because they didn't want it in there. So I had to dig up this stuff. Some of this stuff is barely even translated into English. If you go to Christ in Egypt, you'll find some translations for the first time into English.
Right.
I had to dig up stuff that was in German, handwritten German. It was extremely difficult. On this specific issue, in fact, the December 25th, or rather the winter solstice celebration in ancient Egypt, you'll see people go, oh, well, I've actually seen Egyptologists have read where they said there doesn't seem to be any, winter solstice acknowledgement in Egypt. And I'm going, well, yeah, there certainly is. Here are a bunch of hieroglyphs.
Remember, the question that she's been asked is, where does it say that Horus was born on December 25th, which is the first question on the Zeitgeist Challenge website. But 2 points really quick. She immediately appeals to the idea that the main reason this isn't obvious to other scholars, except for her, is because of a truly massive Christian conspiracy, where Christians destroyed all pagan references that conflicted with their religion. I would like to point out, as I did in the first refutation of her defending of Zeitgeist, that she should produce a logical reason why she thinks that during this time when Christians were being crucified and burned alive for refusing to deny Christ by the Roman Empire, that same Roman Empire gave them some kind of authority to march into temples and homes of pagans and steal and destroy their literature. And if they want to say it's because the Roman Church later, and about 400 years later, decided to go back and destroy all the evidence that conflicted with it, you still have the problem of them or anyone else not knowing what the Egyptian hieroglyphics said at that point, only having been recently been able to be interpreted, and therefore wouldn't be a target of any rampaging Christians because they would have no idea which hieroglyphics said what about Horus being born on December 25th or being crucified, etc. So you should have this pristine record of Horus being born on December 25th or being crucified and all these other things in Egyptian writings. And I'm even willing to say that they might have to be interpreted in such a way to produce that. But nevertheless, there should be a full body of evidence in that regard to this day that would not have been a target of the Catholic Church or rampaging Christians. Why even appeal to this argument if you have solid evidence to prove the initial claim in the first place? Why even say, well, first, before we get started here, I just want you to know that all the evidence was destroyed. But keep in mind, the question here that she's been asked is, where does it say in the Egyptian writings, preferably, but really any other writing before 33 AD, that Horus was said to be born on December 25th? That is the question.
In fact, they include in the book the hieroglyph for the winter solstice. It shows the goddesses Isis and Nephthys on either side of the sun, holding like a baby sun over an ankh, giving life to the sun. This is the hieroglyph for the winter solstice. So they have this beautiful hieroglyph, in fact, to describe the winter solstice. The winter solstice was extremely important in ancient Egypt. There are many buildings aligned to the winter solstice. The Temple of Luxor, I believe, is one. There are, in fact, here's where, when you're talking about the December 25th birthday, okay, now, first of all, why that day and it's not the 21st, 22nd? That needs to be explained, too. There's a 3-day period, a trigium or trigium, that the ancients recognized that at that point it seemed like for 3 days the sun was not moving either south or north. This is from a geocentric perspective. That it was dead in a tomb, so to speak, because that's where it seemed to be going, into the tomb. It was going to die. This is towards the winter solstice when the days are getting shorter and shorter. And so there seemed to be there's this 3-day period where the sun on the sundial seemed to be not moving at all, and the sun was dead. So they said that it stopped. Solstice means sun stops. Sun stops moving. So the sun stopped for 3 days, and then it was born again, and it would be, the 24th at midnight, basically. So that's why we have this Christmas Eve thing going on. So it's not a mistake to say that the sun was born again on the 25th.
No one is really arguing any of those points. The question is in regard to Horus's birth. It is, of course, incredibly noteworthy at this point to point out that Jesus was emphatically not born on December 25th. Even from a purely literary perspective, no ancient text that I'm aware of ever refers to a birth for Jesus on that day or any other day, and that the holiday was constructed several hundred years later, and it was actually based on ancient pagan practices that were established by Rome's version of Christianity in order to appease the pagans in Rome. This is why many Christians, like the earliest Christians, don't celebrate Christmas on that day, because it was widely known to be a pagan holiday. And so the early Christians, when they were told several hundred years later that they now had to begin celebrating Jesus' birthday on December 25th, they were very reluctant because they knew the Bible didn't say anything about it, but they did know that it was an ancient sun worship thing. So they refused, and often were killed for refusing. But remember, the question is, where does it say that Horus was born on December 25th?
Okay, that's not a mistake. That has the ancient tradition, and there's a reason for it. It wasn't like there's some calendar issues going on. Calendar's very fascinating. I've been working on a calendar. I'm going to be releasing that soon.
Okay.
The calendar is very fascinating to follow, too. However, so when we're talking about the winter solstice, December 25th is fine to acknowledge because it is part of the winter solstice, the 3-day period. Okay, so we have, for Horus, for example, we have this ancient testimony called Plutarch. Plutarch is about as close as we're going to get to a kind of a digest, an encyclopedia. Diodorus Siculus, before that, in the 1st century BC, also lays this out. Herodotus does a little bit, but not quite the same as writing kind of an encyclopedia entry type thing. Otherwise, we don't necessarily have this type of writing going back to these eras before that.
So in other words, she doesn't have any Egyptian claims whatsoever that Horus was born on December 25th. Let me remind everyone that the question posed by the Zeitgeist Challenge website is to show any source before Christ that states any of this stuff. And she here tells us point blank that the best she has is Plutarch, who lived well after the death of Christ. She appeals to him later, and we will discuss Plutarch in greater detail there. In addition, because no one at the time of Plutarch could read hieroglyphics to the best of our knowledge, how is he the authority on the Egyptian view of the birth of Horus? Wouldn't it make more scientific, logical sense to find evidence of this claim about Horus's birth nowadays, with hieroglyphics now being able to be read? Let me tell you, if Acharya knew of any Egyptian reference to Horus being born on December 25th, you can bet that she would be telling us that right now instead of Plutarch. But she appeals to Plutarch here, who, as a priest of Delphi, certainly has his own religious reasons for making these claims. But we'll look into that later.
For one thing, as I explain in this document that I just created, especially for you in this show, called Zeitgeist Challenge, the Real Zeitgeist Challenge, which can be accessed at my website, truthbeknown.com.
Right.
I have it right there at the top now, so you just can go right there and boom.
Oh, good.
I describe about this primary source business, which is there's all this squawking about primary sources, this and that. First of all, there are no primary sources for Christianity, so people in glass houses shouldn't be throwing stones. Secondly,
good point.
Actually, Peter, it's a terrible point. She tries to make this claim later on, too, essentially saying that the debunkers want primary sources to prove the physical existence of Krishna or Horus, etc., which is the definition of a straw man argument. The truth is that the primary sources are sought with regard to what the ancient texts said about the various demigods, regardless of whether they existed or not. I and others are asking to be shown what the Egyptians believed about such and such God. Whether or not it was physically true is not being debated, at least by me. That being said, as an aside, I would like to ask you to see my video on the evidence of the existence of the historical Jesus.
Secondly, what this does all the time raises this incredibly infuriating historical period of destruction.
Here she has another diatribe about how the Christians destroyed all of the evidence that she would have liked to produce, and I'm going to skip ahead to some more meatier topics.
How come the Christian writings all survive, but the pagan ones don't? So whenever you hear this primary sources thing, that's what you should be reminded of. The pagan history has been destroyed deliberately. Why? Well, we can kind of piece these things together. So we don't have these things like a neat little encyclopedia entry, but we have indications of it, and then we can go back and check. We have this Plutarch specifically stating that Horus was born at the winter solstice. So what do we find out to corroborate that? We find out, first of all, that he's accurate in almost everything else he says, and this is stated by Egyptologists.
I disagree, and I will give a very logical reason why it is imperative to doubt Plutarch. Primarily because scholars of Plutarch recognize that it was his style in the book Parallel Lives to fabricate information about certain historical figures in order to make parallels. This is a quote from Rex Warner, the author of Fall of the Roman Republic, 6 Lives by Plutarch. This is from the translator's introduction. Plutarch stretches and occasionally fabricates the similarities between famous Greeks and Romans in order that he may write their biographies as a parallel. The lives of Nicias and Crassus, for example, have nothing in common except that both were rich and both suffered great military defeats at the end of their lives. So the very thing that Acharya is saying that Plutarch is good for, i.e., drawing parallels in different lives, is the one thing that scholars know without question that he occasionally lies about.
So we have no reason to doubt him. He's not playing to a Christian audience that's going to say, oh, that's not true, because there isn't such a thing at that point.
This is interesting that she claims that there is no Christian influence on Plutarch, kind of suggesting that he was pre-Christian, because she doesn't tell anybody that he's actually very much not pre-Christian. But nevertheless, she says there wasn't any Christian influence on him, and while I agree that it is possible, considering Plutarch never, to the best of my knowledge, mentions the Christians, it is not very probable, considering that he died in 120 A.D., and he lived in Greece and traveled extensively to places like Corinth and to Rome, where, according to his Roman and Greek contemporaries, like Pliny the Younger and Suetonius and Tacitus, Christian persecution was in full swing in those areas.
Nobody's going to attack him. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's no reason for him to be telling any kind of falsehoods about the story. There's no reason at all.
I will now play a very short clip from the late William Cooper.
Nearly all writers attempting an interpretation of the Osirian cycle have recourse to Plutarch. It has seemingly never occurred to Egyptologists that this eminent priest of Delphi might have purposely confused or distorted the fable, or, if not that, might certainly have misdirected the attention of the reader from relevant to irrelevant explanations. 2 factors must certainly be taken into consideration when reading Plutarch. First, he was an initiated priest of the mysteries.
And there are a lot of reasons why this is interesting, but I'll just break it down to the very basic problem, is that Plutarch was incredibly religiously biased as a worshipper of Apollo, who, according to Diodorus, was the same as the worship of Horus. Apollo later became the idea of worshiping the sun and the solstice, as we'll see later with Gerald Massey, as a chief druid. He worshipped at the winter solstice. He had every religious reason for making history conform to his religious beliefs. This is extremely important to recognize, that everything that they're saying about Christians applies to the sources that they're using to prove their version of history.
What I'm saying, like, there's no reason for him to be telling any kind of falsehoods about the story. There's no reason at all.
Well, he did worship Horus, so maybe that's one reason. And let me once again remind you, the first question that she was asked here, and all this has been about, is where does it say that Horus was born on December 25th?
Absolutely.
So what do we find? We find that, yes, indeed, the birth of the sun is discussed in inscriptions prior to the Common Era. We find also that there are temples to Raharakti, which is one of the aspects of the sun god, the Horus-Ra combination. These temples are aligned to the winter solstice rising sun. And here's a little clincher, and I'm so loath to give out some of this information because it took me so long to dig it up and put it together, and it's in my book.
Sure
There's great stuff in that book that you cannot even imagine how long it took me to find like one paragraph.
I can imagine. I saw the intensity of that book. By all means, I certainly recommend it.
2,400 citations.
Right.
And there are 900 sources.
Right.
I learned Egyptian on the spot. Not all of it. It takes years and years. It's a hugely difficult language, and then you have to learn the hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs themselves are astonishing. To sweep all this under the carpet with this namby-pamby efforts at debunking is just sickening to me.
Frankly. I understand. Yeah, it's just degenerate rejection. We just have to deal with that.
Degenerate.
Yeah. What were you going to say about the issue that you found, though? You can give it away to us.
Oh yeah. Well, here it goes. Okay. The fact is that Horus is the morning sun on every day. Okay. So Horus is born every day of the year.
Interesting.
So that he wasn't born on December 25th, that would be the only day that he isn't born, according to the Egyptians. It's so ridiculous. Of course he's born on December 25th. He's born every single day.
Did you catch that? Now we have regressed to this. This was her, I hate to divulge this information that I dug up, but Horus was born every single day. Now, this means, of course, that Horus and I have a lot in common, because Horus was born, did you know this, on August 21st, which is the exact same day that I was born. That's pretty interesting. If it's really her explanation, the one that she dug up and is so proud of, then it really makes the movie Zeitgeist absolute mind control, because you watch that movie when it talks about this serious accusation that the Egyptian god Horus was said to have been born on December 25th, and they say that that's the same day that Jesus was born.
Horus is the morning sun, Ra is the sun at noon, Tum or Tumu is the sun in the evening, and then Osiris becomes the sun at night.
Gotcha.
And I explain all of this in my book and how this works, that these guys are they are not necessarily the sun themselves. Ra is becoming Horus and Osiris. It is very complicated. But it also this complication also means that there's this interchangeability going on, which is kind of what is reflected in that list that you give in ZG, that
right.
You say Horus was buried for 3 days. It's actually really Osiris, but see, Horus is the rebirth of Osiris, so they really are one.
Exactly.
So,
I made that point to other people, is that no one seems, that's been well documented by other historians as well. These are interchangeable, they transfer, these information transfers. These gods were very different in their structure than the Christian gods or the gods that we talk about today. They morphed, so to speak, in their identities, would you say?
Highly interchangeable.
She's talking about interchangeability. He's talking about morphing. He's saying they morphed because they didn't have the characteristics of any of the Christian stories until they morphed. That's why they are quoting people like Plutarch and those that lived after the time of Christ. She's saying that they're interchangeable. And I'm saying, okay, if Horus and Osiris are interchangeable, that's quite all right. You can take the requirements in the Zeitgeist Challenge for Horus, and you can just assume that it's Osiris or Horus, but you still have the problem of answering these questions. Was Horus or Osiris born on December 25th? Were any of them born of a virgin? Were their births accompanied by a star in the east? Did 3 kings follow to locate and adorn the newborn Savior? At the age of 12, did either of them, did they become a prodigal child teacher? At the age of 30, were either of them baptized to begin their ministry? Did either of them have 12 disciples? Did either of them perform miracles such as healing the sick, walking on water? Were either of them known as the truth, the light? Were they crucified? Were they buried after 3 days and resurrected? That's still the Zeitgeist Challenge. I don't care if it's Horus or Osiris. And trust me, if either one of those, if they had data for any of that, that's what we'd be hearing now. But we're hearing excuse after excuse after.
Well, I know Massey made it very clear that the parallel between God and Jesus was also a parallel between Osiris and Horus, along many other parallels. And of course, as you know, in Christian rhetoric, Jesus and God are basically interchangeable, if I remember correctly. So there's a little bit of that characteristic emerging there too, correct?
The Holy Spirit too.
Yes, exactly.
And we have a kind of a Holy Spirit knum. I'm not sure how to pronounce these things. Nobody is really. We have these different. We have these different characters in the Egyptian too, with the base having to deal with resurrection and afterlife. They were extremely interested in the afterlife and continuity of life and immortality of the soul and so forth. And raising Massey is a good point too, because as I show in Christ in Egypt, this information in no way relies upon him.
Right.
He just happens to be someone who is laudable because he saw it very clearly, and he, in fact, is extremely highly peer-reviewed, by the way. He had his work combed over by some of the best Egyptologists and scholars of the day. And I show that in my book, Christ in Egypt. There's an online excerpt as well, and I link to all of this in this Zeitgeist Challenge ebook that I've created. So the man deserves much greater respect than just this, hand-waving dismissal of, oh, he's this or that. The guy rose from to absolute poverty with no real education, had to work as a child in serious labor back in the bad old days in those countries. And that country was Great Britain, and became extremely well known among the Egyptologists of the day. So in fact, we have our counterparts today attacking us. The people who attacked him, in particular, there was a Catholic Egyptologist who just would rant and rave against him because he was a Catholic.
Of course. Yeah. It's very hard to take. I hate to say it, but it's very hard to take the criticisms of people that are indoctrinated into this faith that seriously, because they obviously have a vested interest in their belief. And that sounds, a little bit, I don't know, it sounds a little difficult to say, but it's very, very true.
This is an excellent time to talk about Gerald Massey and his vested interest in his religious belief, which was Druidism. Let's first sit up and pay attention that Massey was cited 31 times in the movie Zeitgeist. The most outlandish claims were attributed to him. This is second only to Acharya S, who is cited the same number of times, 31. These two authors therefore account for 62 of the most serious claims of the movie. So Peter is telling us how much he pities people with religious bias and how incapable they are of seeing past their ideas. Well, I wonder if this would apply to Gerald Massey. And before I say anything, I want to point out that I am not criticizing Massey simply because he was the chosen chief of the most ancient order of Druids for 26 years, but that the doctrine taught and presumably believed by Massey as a part of the Druidic order would certainly affect his research and would be, by Peter Joseph's own definition and own logic, untrustworthy because of extreme religious bias. Now, Gerald Massey was a member of the ancient order of Druids, and this is not to be confused with actual ancient Druids that were thrown out of countries because of human sacrifice, but more a Neo-Druidism, which is the same kind of Neo-Druidic order that Winston Churchill was initiated into about the same time. But essentially they worshipped or venerated the winter solstice, and they would gather at Stonehenge every year to celebrate this. The religious belief is essentially about reincarnation, which, no matter which way you cut it, is a religious belief. Therefore, Massey, being head honcho of this order for 26 years, makes him one of the most religious people in history. There are many people who do criticize Massey's Egyptian translations, and even modern supporters of Massey know that he was a self-taught Egyptologist who rarely cites sources about his important claims. And while other debunkers, like Keith Thompson, have detailed this better, I would implore you to consider that if Massey was right and his translations were correct, why hasn't any modern Egyptologist confirmed any of it? If you're quick to point to a Christian conspiracy, I would say, well, what about the Muslim Egyptologist or the Chinese Egyptologist or those who have no emotional stake in this? Wouldn't there be someone on the earth that has read the same hieroglyphics or hieroglyphs that Gerald Massey has by now and confirmed it, if it was true? But I suggest the reason that his work is so different and the most logical reason is that he made it up to support his religious belief. Most of you would have no trouble believing this if it was a Christian. I'm just saying that this makes the most sense, all things considered.
You had mentioned the other Egyptologists such as Samuel Birch, he actually wrote a dictionary on hieroglyphics, if I remember correctly, and he was one that approved of many of Massey's writings. In fact, a lot of his own writings, I think, reflect the same information.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, yes, and it was Samuel Birch or Sharp? Birch. Okay. You're reading this more recently than I am because this is, oh my gosh. There's so much information. It's just huge information, hugely important. Actually, Samuel Sharp is the one who wrote about this information, but Samuel Birch is the one who did peer review Massey.
Right.
Quickly to expand on my earlier point is that Samuel Birch was born in 1813. And the Rosetta Stone was found in 1799, and it still took people quite a long time to even get to the very early stages of reading Egyptian hieroglyphs. By the 1820s, the first complete decipherment was made. So this is very, very early on in the understanding of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Therefore, if Massey is correct, you're going to need more peer review than one done in the 1800s. You would need probably a modern scholar, unbiased scholar, to look at Gerald Massey and say, yeah, he was right, even though he had very little to work with.
And he was Department of Antiquities or Egyptology at the British Museum.
Exactly.
So that's really important. Yes, that this was just not some crackpot,
Yeah. And if anyone's ever read his writings, they see, if you ever read Ancient Egypt, Light of the World, which is an amazing work, the only problem with that book to me is that he doesn't give enough sources.
There you have it. Don't take it from me. There's the creator of Zeitgeist who cited this guy 31 times. And when you cite a guy who doesn't cite sources, it's like not citing a source. If you say Gerald Massey said it was true, but Gerald Massey doesn't cite a source, then you've essentially cited no source, and this big list that Zeitgeist has provided is totally meaningless. That's the reason the Zeitgeist Challenge exists.
But his logic is just unparalleled in his review of Egypt, and I just thought it was the most amazing book I had read in a long time when I read it years ago.
Right. And if you read my writing about him in Christ in Egypt, then you start to see where his sources are from.
Exactly. Now you've done the legwork, I think, for a lot of what Massey. His mind moved apparently too fast to be concerned with such things.
You can actually find, it's so fascinating using the internet these days. You can look up the phrases that I was able to find the exact translations that he used.
Excellent.
Because he's quoting translations in there that he didn't, as he said, I'm not making this up. I'm quoting. I'm too. Even though I can read hieroglyphs, he said, I'm too smart to do that. I'm quoting these. This was like Renouf's translation and was it Birch's translation. So in any case, the information that we're talking about here does not rely on Massey.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm still waiting on some information. So far, I've heard that Plutarch was their source, and I heard that also Horus was born on every day, and so far that's basically what we have. So I'm still waiting for some actual sources. So maybe she is going to divulge all that she found from Massey here in the next few minutes, so we'll have an opportunity to analyze some of it.
And it also is not neatly written down. Some of it has to be figured out. Like, it was difficult to come up with the Mary, Isis Mary. Not that it isn't there, but because the word Mary has been used. It means beloved, by the way. It has been used in two different ways. One is the gods are bestowing love upon someone, and so the Pharaoh is called Mary. He is beloved of the gods, and so that epithet is not necessarily attached to the gods. It is attached. You would say Ptah Mary. That would be someone is beloved of Ptah rather than Ptah himself is beloved.
Gotcha.
So that was difficult too. But so I have to go into many pages to explain that. But indeed, Isis was beloved, and she was called Mary.
Okay, so let's look at this. Now, it's important to remember here that Acharya has already said this in her book, The Christ Conspiracy, that's been out for a long, long time. This is the first time she's ever tried to look it up, apparently, and source it. And I commend her for even trying to do that. But as she just got done mentioning there, it's like, hey, this was hard to kind of make that true. And you can kind of see how it's. Remember, she says that Isis was obviously a predecessor to Mary because they were named. She was named Mary. Isis Mary is what she said. Now, we find here, according to her, and whether this is all true or not, I'm not 100% sure, but she says that the name Mary it means beloved of one god or another, and that other gods were attributing this name to themselves, such as Mary Abtwai, Mary Amensetep, Mary Aten, Mary Ka-Ra, Mary Mes, Mary Neter, and Mary Mta, as well as Mary Sokar, Mary Horus, and Mary Osiris. So basically every Egyptian god in Egypt was called Mary. And even if this is true, which she doesn't actually say anywhere here that Mary, Isis, these all appear to be males, what she eventually does is say that that in the Greco-Roman era, and that's what she just got done saying, it's like, well, Isis was called beloved, and what she's referring to there, in the Greco-Roman era, the temples of Isis were calling her beloved or loved, and it still doesn't really fit in with her whole premise, is that Isis was clearly Mary, and this was all a very easy, predecessor to the Christian story. But if every god in ancient Egypt was more frequently called Mary than she ever could have been, even if she was, other than in the Greek, because she was called loved. And it doesn't make any sense if that's the thing. This is obviously a backtracking, trying to, save face, and having to do it with a lot of words. But I want to go really quick into what she was talking about earlier, which is trying to find what Massey was talking about, because clearly in her Christ conspiracy book, she just took everything Massey said and didn't source it because he didn't source it, so now she has to try to go find the sources for Massey. Okay, this is what she says makes this true. And remember, just to look at all the hoops that had to be jumped through in order to make this even slightly true. First of all, we had to go to the Common Era. In order, not ancient Egypt, we had to go into modern Isis worship, if you will, and then we had to make everyone believe that Hathor is the same as Isis, and that anytime anybody is just called loved, they get to also be referred to as Mary, even when you're not in ancient Egypt, and just a lot of stuff. So I'll just read. The ever-important Isis was in fact one of these goddesses known by the title of Mary, especially a few centuries before and into the Common Era. That goddesses were beloved or Mary is obvious from an enigmatic spell that invokes the goddess greatly beloved with red hair, or who is greatly beloved with the red hair. Birch renders this phrase the greatly beloved, red-haired mystical cow. The red of hair, as Faulkner translates the epitaph, represents the much beloved, referring to the cows who are undoubtedly representative of Hathor, another mistress of the gods, and sometimes mother of Horus. In this regard, Massey refers to several times to Hathor Mary, or Isis, after relating that in BD 17 Osiris Ani is found in Anu, which with the hair of Isis spread over him. Massey further states that elsewhere the hair is assigned to Hathor, one of whose names is Mary. He also discusses Hathor, who is Mary, the beloved of by name in the ritual. So don't you see, if she's already quoting just straight up in the Egyptian that all these other gods are clearly named Mary, this one's called Mary, this one's named Mary, here's the source for that. It's just right there. But when it comes to Isis, the whole point, well, the red hair of this cow, and if you all make this, and you go to this era, and you make sure that it's just beloved, and all this stuff, these rules, then you get to call Isis Mary too.
Well, so speaking of Isis, that's the thing that the debunkers don't seem to understand, is that these things require explanation, and they can't be sourced in one paragraph, because you have to have an understanding of the mechanics of the Egyptian religion to get a grasp of this. For example, describe, these are mysteries, correct? The ramifications.
Some of them are.
Yes, but describe what that means, because I don't think anyone knows what this even means, mysteries. The Egyptian mysteries.
Right, the mysteries. Okay, now we have descriptions of mysteries of the fact that they exist, dating back to Herodotus, long before the Common Era, and so forth. Now, they're not necessarily written down, because back then, these what we're calling mysteries were, if you exposed them, if you were initiated into the mysteries and you exposed them to the vulgar masses who were not initiated, or if you wrote them down, especially if you wrote them down, you could be killed. It was a capital offense, and so very few people wrote them down. But they do show up in like little bits and pieces in the writing. You cannot completely keep them out. For example, one of the greatest mysteries was the virgin birth, and so there's not like this great long treatise about it, because you weren't supposed to talk about it like that. We're supposed to write it down. But we find in places in the pre-Christian world. I want to emphasize that, because I also have a definition of what is pre-Christian. That's another point that I like to make. And I do make that in my latest ebook and article that I wrote for you, Peter.
Right. Thank you.
The pre-Christian. That's also in Christ in Egypt. So that Isis is specifically called the Great Virgin on the temple of Seti I at Abydos, which dates to, I think it was the 13th century BCE. And so we're talking about that she was long called the Great Virgin, centuries, over a millennium.
Okay, let's take a look at this claim. First, I find it interesting that if you Google this term, the Great Virgin and Isis and SETI, and put it all into a search engine, you only find links about Acharya S's claim here, which I find is interesting because I think that there would be a lot more information about this if this is exactly what is said on that wall. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that she is right and that this is exactly how it reads at the Temple of SETI. The massive problem here is that we have a much different definition for virgin than the ancient Egyptians did, because an Egyptian virgin can have lots of sex and lots of children and still be called a virgin. Acharya seems to know this, and this is why she writes the following in her book. Quote, apparently, in order to explain how these various goddesses can remain virgins after becoming mothers, Murdock et al. Conclude that the virginity indicated by HWN.T, now this Egyptian word HWN.T is exactly the same word that she just got done quoting when she said, hey, Isis called herself the great HWN.T, Great Virgin, and here this is what she says. Murdock et al. Conclude that virginity indicated that by HWN.T is not virginity at all, a distinction seemingly forced that would be unnecessary if the mythological and astrological nature of the stories were understood, and this perpetual virginity comprehended as a mystery as it is in Christianity. She then says, indeed, Jesus' mother, Mary, was said to be a perpetual virgin, explaining why she could give birth yet remain virginal. Now, this is what really needs a citation. Of course, she has no citation here to say that Jesus' mother Mary was said to be a perpetual virgin, explaining that why she could give birth yet remain virginal. And they go into a big laughing discussion about this here in a second. But the massive problem here with this is that Jesus' mother was not a perpetual virgin at all. According to the Bible, the reason that it calls the birth of Jesus a virgin birth is because at the time of Jesus' birth, Mary had not had relations with any man. So she was a virgin at that point. She is obviously not a virgin forever, as her and Joseph go on to have several children according to the Bible. In fact, two of Jesus' brothers, Jude and James, became great men of the early underground church. Isis may have been a perpetual virgin. I don't know. She clearly wasn't an actual virgin, even according to Acharya S.
And it's a perpetual virginity, correct? Just like Krishna.
Yeah.
Krishna's
Well,
mother.
yeah. There's an interesting. I explain that whole odd weirdness going on with the Krishna myth too, because there's all these people freaking out about that word. But
of course.
But yes, like the Virgin Mary, who gives birth but is considered a virgin, even though in the New Testament it says that Christ has brothers and sisters, and we know that at least.
Hey, actually, Peter, Joseph, and Acharya S and I agree on this point. That's because the Catholic Church came up with this doctrine, a doctrine that they just said, you have to believe this or, you're going to get killed. And many people did get killed for not believing this very thing, which was that Mary was always a virgin. It makes no sense. The Bible clearly says that she wasn't, that Jesus had brothers. Like after that, Joseph and Mary did eventually consummate their marriage and have brothers and sisters, and that Jude and James, they wrote books in the Bible, for goodness sakes. But this is crazy to just say, hey, there it is, and then to have the Catholic Church say, no, it's not, it's a perpetual virginity. What you're calling Christianity, you're telling everybody that real Christianity is this weirdness of perpetual virginity and anything else that the Catholic Church tells you that Christianity is, and you're seeing what the Bible is saying is totally different than that. So maybe for once they're kind of seeing what I'm talking about, but obviously they don't, because they go on to make that quite clear.
I love how people just miss that entirely.
Yeah.
Just,
yeah.
That is
well,
amazing.
There's at least 2 sisters, and there's 4 brothers. The 4 brothers are named, and so there's at least 6 other children. And the Catholic Church has, covered up this part by saying, well, they're cousins. They're cousins.
Right, exactly.
Cousins. Oh, okay. Well, we'll just ignore them as cousins.
Or they say the gesture of the brothers is these are they semantically manipulate it, which is
yes,
fascinating
that's right.
too.
Yeah, or they were from Joseph's prior marriage. All of a sudden, Joseph has a prior marriage. They have to just keep adding to the story.
Right, exactly.
That's not in the Bible, though, so we can't talk about that. It's not ordained. So anyway, with the brothers and the sisters, the Virgin Mary, they talk about her as being perpetually virginal. And that, in fact, is an old motif too. And we have this discussion in Philo, and I go into great detail in Christ in Egypt about this virgin birth mystery in Philo, this ancient Jewish writer who absolutely had nothing to do with Christianity, except that Christianity apparently copied him almost whole cloth.
Wow.
But
I'm pretty sure she's referring to the theories of Bruno Bauer here, who she's quoted on her website as apparently liking his writings. Bruno Bauer was a German writer who was a contemporary of Nietzsche and Marx and Engels. And just look up refutations of Bruno Bauer out there. And this is kind of too lengthy to go into right now, but I would just tell you that, like so many other things, it's just wrong. You can also check out. I did something called Pollyanity Debunked, a 3-part series on that, which Bruno Bauer espouses as well. So there's lots of different ways to debunk Bruno Bauer. But yeah, moving on.
He certainly did not copy Christianity, but he talks about the virgin birth, and he talks about, interestingly enough, a sort of born-again virginity, which comes through the grace of God. And he speaks of this Abraham's wife Sarah as being a born-again virgin. And so this is the Jewish discussion. Of course, they don't talk about gods and goddesses, but we have this virgin birth thing going on here that they're obviously completely aware of it in the pagan world too. That the Jews were aware of this. That's why they changed the word in Isaiah 7:14 from Alma to Parthenos when they translated it into the Greek. They're obviously aware that there's this virgin birth motif going on.
Now, this is an argument in my favor that on close inspection, it does appear that the ancient prophet Isaiah was in fact saying that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. It's not something that the Jewish people would have immediately noticed, but when they looked back on the prophecies of the Messiah and they could see, it does say that he would be born of a virgin. So they changed it because it was too close to Jesus. Now, remember what we're talking about here, that the Bible is talking about a virgin birth in the sense of it's saying in a very historical way that a woman who had never had sex gave birth to a child. Not any perpetual virginity or no extra baggage is needed. That's the issue with the Zeitgeist Challenge. They said, and have been saying since Zeitgeist, that Isis and all these other gods, like Devaki, the mother of Krishna, also had virgin births, in the sense that, they said they had virgin births in the movie, but now we find out, oh, no, they weren't virgins when they gave birth. Isis was never said to be a virgin. What are you, crazy? No, we were talking about perpetual mystery virginity. Krishna, oh no, she's not in the virgin in the sense that there was a virgin birth. She had 7 children before she gave birth to Krishna.
We have Isis being called the Great Virgin. Many other goddesses are talked about this way. The goddess Neith, who's somewhat interchangeable with Isis. We have her temple at Sais, which is pre-Christian, where she talks about no mortal has lifted up by cloth, and this is an indication that she's virginal. She doesn't come out and say, I'm the Great Virgin, which Isis does at the temple of Seti I. But she does say, I am untouched, and yet I bring forth the sun, S-U-N. So this motif is there, and it's solid.
Yeah.
And yet, like I said, you can't just you have to point to these various elements of it.
Right.
You can't just say nobody sat down and wrote, well, look, this is like, let's say 200 BC here. Well, Christianity's going to come along, so I better write this beforehand. That nobody thought to do that. They didn't sit down and say, let's prove that our thing came first because someone's going to come later and copy it and then pretend that we didn't exist.
Right.
I thought it would be great to find that. They'd have to be incredibly psychic, though. So.
Well, let's Is there anything else on the Horus subject that you want to address? Because there's that list, maybe it's in front of you as well, but because we're moving quickly with time, there's all the other gods too. You can basically touch on whatever you'd like to with this list that the Zeitgeist Challenge has.
Okay, let's see. The Horus was crucified business. Okay, now, it does give an indication, kind of a suggestion that he was killed that way, but you're giving a digest here. He wasn't really killed by being crucified. Now.
Oh, this should be interesting, how Horus was crucified but didn't die. Also, I would like to know, who invented crucifixion. I guess the ancient Egyptians did. I guess we'll find out about that in a second.
We do have a pre-Christian, by the way, the Diodorus.
Really, didn't die from crucifixion. That none of the gods in the Zeitgeist Challenge, what they said, because they said all these gods were crucified, but now we're finding, no, they weren't crucified. What we meant to say, and what we probably should have said, is that they were just pictured apparently with their arms outstretched. Now, the image that immediately comes to my mind is the one that was on the cover of the Jesus Mysteries, the Freakin' Gandhi book, that has this picture of and that I know Jordan Maxwell and Acharya S have used a lot, and that I know is on the cover of the Zeitgeist thing or whatever, that they used to say, here, like in Zeitgeist Addendum, when they refreshed everybody on what the ancient religions all seemed to be telling us about, that they were just Jesus repackaged, showed this little amulet that apparently was supposed to be Bacchus or Dionysus in cruciform. But what you don't find about that is that amulet is dated to be, conservatively the 2nd century after Christ, but probably more likely the 3rd and 4th century, and that it concluding basically that however reliably or unreliably that the amulet does not show a crucified pagan, but is actually showing a crucified Jesus. Now, it's also helpful to note that what you're seeing in that picture is an artist representation, not the actual amulet itself, too. I'll link in the notes in the show where they show where this is just a 4th century piece of jewelry that's clearly forged and that Freakin' Gandhi has essentially been busted. But now she tells us that what we have to say that Horus was crucified was, of course, not Horus, but Osiris, and that it was on this Jed pillar. Now, you spell Jed, D-J-E-D, and find out what she's talking about here, and see if this looks to you like a cruciform, somebody that is crucified. See if you saw this picture and you said, "Oh, didn't you know that Osiris was crucified?" Yeah. Here's the proof of it. And that's what Acharya is saying. It's like, no, they weren't crucified. They were in cruciform. Granted, the one that we showed you in Zeitgeist Addendum is a fabrication, but here's the proof: the Jed pillar. Also, I want to point out that all of her answers to these questions about the Zeitgeist Challenge have had the same style, which is, well, no, he wasn't really crucified, or no, well, I mean, he actually wasn't killed in any real sense, like we said in the movie, or he wasn't really born of a virgin. I mean, his mother wasn't actually a virgin when he gave birth to him. Or no, well, I mean, he wasn't actually, born on December 25th in one sense. I mean, he was born every day of the week, and I guess you might as well pick December 25th as any other. All of these are just are lies. Every answer to the question is, well, that's not true, but let me explain.
We have him with the Ankh, which is the crux ansata. It's a cross. Right. We have Osiris in this form with Isis and Nephthys, who are called the two Merti, on either side of him. This is almost like a astounding parallel with Christ, with the two Marys on either side of him. I've got these two images juxtaposed.
Okay, that's classic Acharya S. She will find what she has and then try to find some parallel in the Bible. In this case, she says, two Marys on either side of him. And of course, Jesus was crucified between two thieves, not two Marys. She's not really mentioning what she would love for that to be the parallel, but there's just Mary Magdalene apparently at the crucifixion, and as well as his mother also viewing it. So that's what she's meaning by in between two Marys there. And that's, of course, assuming you buy her Isis as Mary from the Roman mystery religions, and you go through that whole thing, which people a lot smarter than me have debunked that thoroughly. And of course, they wouldn't have actually died from this crucifixion because it's just this Egyptian image that the Egyptians apparently didn't actually believe was any kind of crucifixion of Osiris or Horus. But Acharya S knows that that's what they meant by it. And her proof of that is that here is this picture of this pillar with arms next to two Marys, which aren't really Marys except in Acharya S's mind. And Jesus wasn't even crucified in between two Marys. This is a series of lies. It's the wicked web you weave when first you practice to deceive. You have to build every lie on top of one another until you've come up with this insanity.
Right.
And that's really the imagery we're trying to get across.
Exactly.
That this was copied whole cloth. And that if you were going to depict your God in cruciform, and you didn't want to be like, well, hey, that's just another one of the same that we've already got, then you might make up a story and say, well, he was thrown to the ground by Romans and put, actually tacked up onto a cross, which they didn't even do like that. They had this stake. They didn't necessarily put people in a cross shape like that.
Right.
So, but if you were trying to imitate, the whole point is that this motif of
symbol.
a God on a cross or in cross shape, this motif was very sacred prior to the Christian era.
Yes.
Well, this motif in Christianity, the God on the cross, was not even depicted in artwork until like the 5th or 6th century.
Exactly.
So we don't even, we find pre-Christian artifacts, or I should say artifacts, well, we do find them in gods in cruciform and goddesses.
And then she goes on to say that the early church didn't venerate the crosses, which I totally agree with. There wasn't any reason for them to. It's not a biblical concept to venerate this cross. This is in fact something that became a symbol, and it's a holdover from a lot of the Roman Catholic Church and things like that, and maybe not necessarily all of that, but I'm not saying it's a terrible bad thing to do, but it's certainly not something that the early Christians did or that the Bible talks about in any way.
Even that is a kind of an erroneous concept. If there were people being crucified in the ancient world, they weren't necessarily, as I say, put out on a cross like that. There was this the word stavros in the New Testament has different meanings. Also in the New Testament in Acts, Christ is depicted as being hung on a tree.
Right, exactly.
And this is another motif.
And that's just like Attis too. Attis had the festival of Attis in Rome, and they would put him on the tree, peg him to the tree as well in the same type of form.
The pine tree.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
sorry
right.
To interrupt you.
No. As far as Attis goes, that's really easy to show where these particular characteristics come from. Now, and they're continually restated by a number of authorities and scholars, modern scholars, and I have that in that ebook that I just created. But, of course, this stuff wasn't written down until, hundreds of years after Christ supposedly lived. So the apologists like to say that the Attis story was based on Christianity and so forth because, there's no writing down of this.
Right.
We're talking about, again, mysteries. We're talking about, this is the God is certainly pre-Christian, without a doubt, or should I say pre-Common Era, without a doubt. And from Diodorus we can glean certain things. We can glean his death and his mourning. We've got priests parading around with his image, which is a pretty common motif of a resurrection. They're saying, in the Egyptian, they would say, "This is Osiris. He has been risen. He is risen."
Did you catch that connection that she says that Diodorus says that people were, dancing around with images of this god, which to her means that he was resurrected. Also notice that they're talking about the Roman mystery religion version of this. Attis is she's saying this is really easy to prove. We have all this writing. Of course, all that writing comes at least 200 years after the time of Christ. And I'm saying from a scientific perspective, you can't know that wasn't influenced by Christianity. you can't. That's the reason the Zeitgeist Challenge says, hey, if you want to prove that this God did all the stuff that you said it did, why don't you use the accounts before Christ so we can, eliminate the possibility that it was influenced by Christianity? Because as she just got done said, well, certainly the God was pre-Christian, but we don't have any writings until 200 years afterwards, which I'm saying is probably a part of what the general concept of the mystery religions did, is that they did, in fact, take the old gods and then attribute Christian qualities to them. Even what she quotes in the old, when she talked about this in the former debunking, she quotes a person to prove that Attis was resurrected. I just looked it up. His name was A.T. Fear, and he said that the Attis cult modified itself over the years, and it was probably a result of the challenge posed by Christianity. That's the quote from the person that she quotes from to prove that Attis was resurrected in the stories that were said 200 years after Christ.
They would have his image. They would bring out his image out of the temple and say, see, here's the God, he's back again. And so if you have priests parading around with an image, it's usually indicative that the God has risen. So to say that Attis was a dying and rising God is pretty solid. Certainly it's already been stated by some expert, this Mettinger, for example. Dr. Mettinger is an extremely well-respected expert on the resurrection motif.
We'll look at that in a second.
And that motif was there, there's no doubt about it. Then you have the whole virgin birth mystery again that is in certain texts, but these texts now, in order to make kind of a list, you would have a problem with digging up Latin resources or Greek resources that are not readily translated, that are not easily found. Nobody's reciting these things. It tends to talk over the heads of the masses.
Sure.
This is why we have to bring it forth in multiple ways. One way is to bring it forth in the digest that you've produced, which is much, it's like very striking. Okay, here it is.
Sure.
Now, is this how the ancient world would have seen it? Well, in the case of Attis, yes. The Christians are actually complaining, hey, they're copying us. They've got all the elements. So they must have seen it as being the same.
This I find just fascinating, because I know that Acharya knows that the scholars agree that the mystery religions change after Christianity to incorporate Christianity. And she's pointing to this idea that the Christians at that time of the Attis cult, 200 years later, were pointing to the Attis cult and others and saying, hey, look at these guys, they're all copying Christianity now. Have you guys seen what they're doing over at the Attis temple? They've totally copied Christianity. And she's saying because Christians are having said that, which would be obvious, as according to scholars, that's what these cults did, is they copied Christianity. And she's saying because Christians are pointing that out, that means that somehow or another, that what appeared 200 years after Christianity somehow was the predecessor to Christianity. It doesn't make any logical sense, but she's just saying that like she has no idea that the mystery religions, incorporated Christian ideas into their mystery religions 200 years later. 200 years is a long time. That's like longer than the history of America. So it's kind of a big gap there between, Christianity and this stuff showing up in Attis religions. And as she had mentioned, Attis, the actual God, was a very pre-Christian God that didn't have any of these attributes until much, 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 much later.
Yeah.
It's not just like some kind of weird interpretation that we're putting on it right now. We're not putting a spin on it. The Christians themselves were saying this. These guys are imitating us. So if they're that close to them, now, as I point out, this death and resurrection motif in the spring is unquestionably pre-Christian. We find it in the myth of Persephone. We find it in the story of Tammuz, Dumuzi, in the Sumerian. It's been traced to the 3rd millennium by the same expert Mettinger.
Let me read from a book by William Lane Craig about this topic, and specifically about T.N. Mettinger. But he starts by quoting David Aoun, a specialist in comparative ancient Near East literature, when he concludes, no parallel to them, resurrection tradition, is found in Greco-Roman biography. Indeed, most scholars have come to doubt whether, properly speaking, there really were any myths of dying and rising gods at all. In the Osiris myth, one of the best-known symbolic seasonal myths, Osiris does not really come back to life, but in all simply continues to exist in the nether realm of the departed. In a recent review of the evidence, T.N.D. Mettinger reports, from the 1930s a consensus has developed to the effect that the dying and rising gods died, but did not return or rise to life again. Oh, that's what this guy, who she's quoting as proof of this, says. Those who still think differently are looked upon as residual members of an almost extinct species. This is what her famous Mettinger says about, well, Acharya S, that she is looked on as a residual member of an almost extinct species.
The story of Persephone, who dies and goes, well, they never say she dies, but she goes into Hades, which is the underworld where most people are dead. Right. She goes into Hades and she rises out. Persephone's rise was celebrated at least probably annually, but her rise out of the underworld is when the spring comes. And I remember being taught this as a child. This was one of the fascinating myths that I actually understood. When you strip these myths of their nature-worshipping background and their astrotheology and so forth, they become mystifying and strange and weird and unpleasant to
Sure.
deal with. But when you put it into a sensible context like that, then look at that. Well, of course that makes sense. And so the placement of Christ's death and resurrection at Easter, springtime, is so convenient because that's when it was already being celebrated. The death and the resurrection of the god or the goddess.
Now, wait a minute. Now, wouldn't the spring equinox is like March 20th, give or take, but the resurrection of Jesus was on Passover, not Easter, and Passover is like April 8th, April 15th, or whatever. That it's not associated with the spring equinox at all.
It was already being celebrated at that time. There's no two ways about it. Now, we have these Attis celebrations going on at that exact time. Are they imitations of a guy who lived in Judea, or are they archetypical representations of the spring celebration? Which makes more sense to you?
Good point. I always thought it was very arrogant of Christian scholars to automatically assume that anything that happened over past 1 A.D. could have been ripped off from Christianity. Even in the Festival of Attis, they had marked that at about the 2nd century A.D. in Rome, where they were pegging Attis to a pine tree, and they were putting him in a tomb for 3 days, and he was resurrected.
There you go. You have it from Peter Joseph saying it's really arrogant for Christians to assume that anything after 1 A.D., had to have been influenced by Christianity. But then he says, the Attis things where he's trying to paint this as early, like right around 1 A.D., but this is 200 years later, an extremely long time, and he's saying it's arrogant for anybody to assume that this Attis cult would have been influenced by Christianity in any way. And that's not me talking. That's not me saying, well, it seems like they probably would, being in Rome and Rome obviously persecuting Christians for that 200 years. They probably would have at least heard about it. And he's saying it's arrogant, but scholars like A.T. Fear, who she quotes in support of her ideas, clearly doesn't support her ideas because he's saying that they clearly were copying Christian myths in response to Christianity. That's his words, A.T. Fear.
This is historical information. Well, I haven't particularly sourced it, but the Christians come back with the fact that, that had to have been stolen. I just think it's incredible that that's the disposition that they take. We have about 15 minutes left, and let's jump around to some of these other gods that are on this site.
Okay.
So we like, for example, why don't you go into Dionysus a little bit?
Okay. Well, Krishna is in order, so let me go to the Krishna one because that's
okay. Yes, sure.
Such an interesting. I love it. This really has just allowed for more of this wonderful information to be dug up. So, the people crying foul about the word virgin, describing Christian's mother. First of all, as far as I'm concerned, as you can tell if you read my book, Sons of God, Krishna, Buddha, and Christ Unveiled, neither Krishna nor his mother are real people. So you got to disabuse yourself of the notion that these characters that we're talking about were real people. They don't have genitalia, and they're not considered to be, penetrable or sullyable or whatever.
Right.
They're always virginal. Even Zeus, with all of his randy exploits, was considered a virgin.
I think that she's trying to say that because these gods didn't actually exist, they get to be virgins because they don't because they're not real. They of course wouldn't have had any real sex and therefore are virgins in that sense. And I could be wrong. Maybe she's trying to say something different, but she could be implying that Christian apologists are wanting primary sources that these gods actually existed, and that's why they're asking for primary sources. But that's not what I think anybody is trying to do. They're trying to find out what did it say somewhere in ancient, in the ancient Hindu writings that that Devaki, Krishna's mother, had never had sex at the time that she gave birth to Krishna. Was it a miraculous birth in the sense that she had never had sex and gave birth to Krishna? Not whether or not she was some perpetual virgin or some mystery virgin, but that there was a virgin birth.
Right.
It's called Parthenos. This goes on. It's just these are myths. Okay, so if you start looking at the mythology behind Krishna and Devaki, you start seeing, well, Krishna looks like a very, very much a solar myth, a sun god, and Devaki is starting to look a lot like a dawn goddess. She's the incarnation of Aditi, who's the virginal mother goddess of the dawn. In going back to the Rig Veda, prior to the Common Era, 1,000 years or more.
Right.
So
I'm not sure what she means by the virginal mother of the dawn. Maybe that if she was, I think that she's trying to say that if she's actually just the dawn, and I'm pretty sure this is what she's trying to say, and he's the sun and she's the moon, then of course she would be virginal because moons don't have sex.
You have this concept of the virginal dawn giving birth to the sun every morning. You know how the morning sky is so clear and clean and refreshing, and then if you have this like rosy-fingered dawn, as Homer put it, you've got this brilliant morning sunlight coming up. It's just very striking, and you can see why it would be considered virginal.
Again, notice her answers are always, well, no. I mean, Devaki wasn't a virgin. She had 7 children before she gave birth to Krishna. That's what it says. Whether or not she's real or not, that's what it says. But if she is like a symbol of the sky, then maybe she's a virgin because, the skies don't have sex because it's a sky. And, in the morning it kind of seems sort of virginal. So, Krishna's mother was a virgin as long as she's the sky and stuff.
Absolutely.
Just absolutely pure and newly born, and so there's that case to be made, which I make in Sons of God, about Krishna's mother being incarnation, or she is the incarnation of Aditi in traditional mythology, and the Aditi is the sun goddess. But interestingly enough, there's a myth attached to her where she, as a teenager, presumably a virgin teenager, eats the seed of a mango and becomes pregnant. So, Krishna's mother very much was a virgin mother. Whether or not she is when she gives birth to Krishna is the issue. However,
no, that is the issue.
They go on and on because she had other children before him. Again, we're talking about a mythical character. We're not talking about a real person, like the Virgin Mary, who supposedly has other children. In fact, they end up with the same or similar number of children. There's a perpetual virginity going on here. But if you so insist, change the word to chaste instead of virginal, and call it a miraculous birth. The difference is the same.
Right.
Krishna was born of a miraculous birth. So now we can move on from there. But all of this stuff is written down, and it's quite fascinating. Oh, by the way, there is this virgin birth mystery in Indian texts. The Mahabharata goes into it. We have a goddess. The goddess Kunti says, "Without a doubt, through the grace of that god, I once more became a virgin."
Again, she can argue this perpetual virgin thing all day long because it's not biblical at all. Mary in the Bible is not said to be a virgin perpetually. In fact, it's quite clear that Joseph and Mary, after she...
With Christianity. Dionysus, same thing. Whether or not his mother Semele could be deemed a virgin, is it stated in the ancient texts that she was Parthenos? Parthenos, by the way, if you can't find this stuff, go look up the word Parthenos, genetically. You look up these words. this is the word that's used by scholars to describe this virgin birth phenomenon. I've seen it used in describing Neith, again, this Egyptian goddess dating back. It's like 7,000 years, this concept of the Virgin Mother goes back. 7,000 years, right?
Wow.
You don't necessarily see this. They don't spell it out. They use the word Parthenos. And if you don't know Greek and you don't know the other languages, can't research in foreign languages, you won't find this. It's not an encyclopedia. If you open the encyclopedia, you can't look up Parthenos and where it says virgin birth motif that predates the Christian era by thousands of years. They just don't have it in there. They use these scholarly terms that go over your heads. Okay.
Right. Exactly.
So.
Well, let's take a look at the Greek-English lexicon and see if it goes over our head. But first, I want to point out that Shemale, the mother of Dionysus in all the texts, she's not said to be a virgin in the story. It has nothing to do with her not having sex or not. In fact, the baby that she gives is taken by Zeus, and that he's the father of, sews the baby in his leg, so she doesn't even give birth to him, let alone a virgin birth. And even if she is called, which I'm not even sure just by the way that Acharya kind of bounced around there, I doubt that she actually is called Parthenos.
Dionysus, same thing. Whether or not his mother Semele could be deemed a virgin, is it stated in the ancient text that she was Parthenos?
But even if she is, the term, according to the Greek-English lexicon, that's supposedly supposed to go over our heads, the second definition is unmarried women who are not virgins. And so, this whole thing is just getting crazier and crazier.
Okay, so Dionysus, turning water into wine, easy one, it's in Diodorus Siculus. December 25th, no question about it. Macrobius states that. Now, Macrobius is 4th century, the Common Era.
Right.
However, we have Dionysus tradition being born on the 6th or 7th, was it the 5th or the 6th? 5th or 6th of January, and there is very much good reason to believe that was, that certainly was before Macrobius moves it to the winter solstice.
Is there any doubt now that they are just telling everybody the mystery religions, that when they say, oh, Dionysus was born on December 25th, according to the 4th century mystery religion cult,
that this, in one calendar or another, this time, the 5th and the 6th, were also the winter solstice. So the effect is the same.
Right. Exactly. And there's also a Christian religion in existence now that uses the January 6th as the celebration of today. Right. Yeah.
The Orthodox and I think it was the Armenian, they believe that Christ was born on the 6th of January, which also was the birth of Ion. In also December 25th was too. The effect is the same. It's the winter solstice. It's the sun. It's the birth of the sun god.
The effect is definitely not the same. You said in the movie that Dionysus was said to be born on December 25th, and then when the Zeitgeist Challenge asks you to produce a source before the time of Christ that says this, you say that you can't, but you do have one 400 years later, which is clearly influenced by Christianity and part of the Roman Dionysus mystery cult. Then you say that's the proof. And then you go on and say, well, since some Christians celebrate the birth of Jesus on this other pagan day, there's some kind of proof right there. But all it proves is exactly what I've been saying the whole time, is that this is exactly the same time when all the pagan ideas and holidays were being forced onto Christianity by Rome, who had then at this time started to take it over, right around 300, 400 A.D. And so they're just validating that concept.
So, again, there's all these intimations of Christ being a sun god, having to do with, there's so many different, a lot of my work has to do with that. I have this entire book, Jesus as a Son Throughout History. Actually, it's not a book yet, but they have an e-book written on that. Let's see, King of Kings, God's only begotten Son, Protogonos would be, which is kind of the firstborn, really. Dionysus is called the firstborn. Alpha and Omega, ancient inscription apparently. The research I found on that was in French. If you didn't know French, you probably wouldn't be able to find it.
because she mentions this is an ancient inscription. She never says how ancient, and I don't think that she really intends to, because it's a big problem. And the reason is that the book that she's quoting is taking another man's work out of context. This French guy named Boissobre, in his book, The History of Manichaeism, which basically is a history of Gnosticism, because he was, as far as I could tell, a Protestant reformer guy who was exposing Gnosticism, which was really only possible after the breaking free from the Catholic Church, who, in my opinion, was accusing people when they were exposing Gnosticism of being part of the Cathars or whatever, and their lives were in danger for exposing Gnosticism because of the widespread adoption of Gnostic principles and beliefs for thousands of years in the Catholic Church. So anyway, this French reformer says the following about this inscription, this Gnostic inscription, this very post-Christian era inscription, as he's trying to expose Gnosticism. He says, this amulet, it is I who lead you, you and everlasting, you look. It is I who keep you or save, I am Alpha and Omega. There below the inscription, a snake holding its tail in its mouth, and around the circle it describes Greek 3 letters, which are the number 365. The snake, which is usually an emblem of eternity, is here that the sun and its revolutions. Keep in mind this is from Google Translator, so it's a little weird. So Acharya, in a roundabout way, quotes this and says it proves that Dionysus was called Alpha and Omega before Christian times. But not even the Gnostics themselves would buy that whopper based on this. We know very well what Boissobre was referring to, and it's called the Abraxas. And it's exactly how he's describing here. It's got the serpent and the serpent tail. You can go look at a picture of this. It's got the 365, even the Alpha and Omega. But what she's not telling you is that this was invented by Belsides in the early 2nd century, who was a chief of a Gnostic sect of his name. Now, the hilarious thing about this is that she's telling you that Alpha and Omega is what they call Dionysus, and this is her proof of that, and she is quoting, essentially, a Gnostic amulet. The very definition is influenced by Christianity. 2nd century Gnosticism was nothing except for influenced by Christianity. So in no way, shape, or form is this proving that Dionysus was called the Alpha and Omega?
Let's see, death and resurrection, that's easy. That's a no-brainer. How anyone could not find Dionysus being described as dying and resurrecting is they haven't studied for even 5 minutes.
Well, I would say that if you study for 5 minutes, you'll be struck with how many versions of Dionysus's death there are. And considering there's so many, you would expect one to be kind of close. And I would give this to her because I've always thought that this is about as close as it gets, this one thing. And that's because Dionysus was annually killed. Remember, Dionysus was the god of wine. So he was annually killed, dismembered, and resurrected, which is a symbol of grapes, being annually picked and squashed and turned into wine, and then growing again next year.
Well, we're running out of time. Let's jump into Mithra for the last 5 minutes.
Right. Okay. Born of a Virgin. I have some lovely research on that in this Zeitgeist Challenge ebook that I just created. It's just absolutely beautiful. First of all, in order to get away with this fraud about primary sources, again, we hear this nonsense that there was nothing written down. They say nothing was written down about Mithra because his was a mysteries cult. Of course, there were many mysteries cults, and there was stuff written down about them, but nothing was written down. So they're actually admitting that the mysteries were not written down, but they were there, so there was something to them.
Yes.
But in the case of Mithra, there was a bunch of stuff written down, and there were multiple volumes of it, and yet they were destroyed. Why were they destroyed?
No, I don't know. I wish she would tell us where she knows what was in them and what they said if they were destroyed. That would be extremely important information.
And then there was also just a massive amount of ruins. We still dig up now and again, fortunately, but it's huge. All over Europe, there was all this Mithraic remains. And
right.
So we have this, and this is before Christianity had any prominence at all. So, to say that Mithraism copied from them is just ludicrous. It was
right.
all over the place.
Notice that she said it was before Christianity had any prominence. Clearly, it was after Christianity.
But this claim that the Mithra is self-generated out of a rock, and therefore there's no Virgin Mother. Well, according to the Iranian scholars and texts, I guess they're Armenian texts, Mithra there is virgin birth. His father was born of a virgin, and apparently he too was identified with his father. And so the Iranian or Persian, remember Mithra is a Persian god, and I think that perhaps the Persian scholars know more about the subject than Christian apologists.
Sure.
Mithra's father was born of a virgin who becomes pregnant from the water of the milky fountain of immortality.
So, in other words, Mithra wasn't born of a virgin. He was born out of a rock. But his father was born in a miraculous kind of way, much like every Greek god in the history of Greek gods is said to have a weird way of entering the world. But that does not equate to his mother being said to have been a virgin before she had him. Remember, the Bible says that Mary had Jesus even though she hadn't had sex before. That's what was being implied. And so the movie Zeitgeist and all of Acharya's books, when they say that Mithra was born of a virgin, they're obviously trying to draw a parallel that the mother of Mithra similarly had a child without having sex before. But then we get this explanation. Oh, well, Mithra was born out of a rock. He didn't have a mother, but his father had some weird stuff happen when he was born.
This is not copying Christianity. There's nothing even remotely resembling that they just took it. If anything, the copying was the other way around because it was taken from these cosmic concepts and it was turned into a real person. It was given a mundane origin as opposed to what the original was. It has to do with the dawn. It has to do with Virgo. It has to do with this lovely milky fountain of immortality. All these great cosmic concepts that have now been really kind of bastardized by being put into history, claim that this was a historical virgin birth, and blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
The whole concept has actually been ruined by this, this forced anthropomorphization, this historization has actually ruined all these wonderful cosmic concepts that permeate.
Yeah.
So when you restore, I'd like to say this, it's a good place to say this, Mithra, by the way, these other things are easily shown to be true. The 12 disciples, we can call them companions if you like, because there were several. There would have been a lot more if they hadn't been. All of the ruins hadn't been destroyed. Everything had been destroyed. That here he is depicted in the center with the 12 signs of the zodiac around him. Repeatedly, we see Mithra depicted in iconography like that.
Again, this is the Roman mystery religions after the time of Christ. You just forgot to mention that one again, I guess.
So Mithra and the 12. The point is not whether they were called disciples, which is a nice Greek word. The point is that they were called companions or friends, or that here was a God-man with 12. Okay? Don't get hung up on whether or not they used those words. Those are straw man arguments.
And I suppose pointing out that this is hundreds of years after the time of Christ, that's a straw man argument too. Because scientifically speaking, it's clear that they were influenced by Christianity, and that this is what the mystery religions provably are doing. This is what Gnosticism set the bar to do, to take Christianity and inform it into the pagan religions. That's what the Catholic Church did. This is a pattern over and over and over. When you say mystery religions, that's what you are meaning. The forming of Christianity into the ancient pagan traditions. This is what Bill Cooper was talking about. This is why, if Bill Cooper was still alive today and he didn't get killed right after 9/11, that there would be no Zeitgeist. There would be no Acharya S. or Michael Tsarian or Jordan Maxwell. And see my movie, William Cooper Debunked Jordan Maxwell, for more on that, because I know that he interviewed him. And so there would be no opportunity for it, because if he was still a leader in this movement of people that are seeking truth, this stuff would be so exposed. It would be so obvious to truth seekers what has happened with Peter Joseph and Acharya S. and what's happening as this is part of the externalization of the hierarchy. That is, indoctrinating the awake world into the mysteries. That's what was being talked about, what the preparation, the externalization of the mysteries is what Alice Bailey called it. The hierarchy is what others call it. But the purpose is to indoctrinate the truth seekers out there into this new mindset. for a specific reason, because what they're eventually going to try to pull with a world system, a world socialist system, is going to require a new kind of unifying religion. This is extremely as important, if not more important, than the infrastructure of the world government and all the cameras and the chips or whatever that they're putting up around us. This is more important than that, because in that system you still need a direct sort of obedience. And as Blavatsky said, the externalization of the hierarchy is for one purpose: the preparation of people for what she calls the world teacher. And if you go listen to Lucius Trust Radio or whatever, they're all abuzz about the world teacher coming. And so what this does is it gets in people's mind this idea of the return of the many avatars of ancient times. And so if they can essentially put somebody at the helm of this that will seem like an ancient avatar, and they can produce some sort of supernatural stuff in order to really get the world thinking, is this just like when Krishna or Buddha came? Is this the Christ consciousness that's returned at this very important time in history? And then all of a sudden we'll be like, this is a real deal God here on earth. This is a real deal God, That is what this is all preparation for. And that's why the externalization of the hierarchy is so big. That's why the day that Zeitgeist, came out and got popular, that they lifted the ban on Google video for conspiracy movies. As long as Zeitgeist was #1, they were quite all right to lift that ban and let people begin to learn about 9/11, learn about the Federal Reserve. But that's even part of this plan, is because pretty soon it's going to be the recognition that the old system is broken, and in the same thing that Zeitgeist provided, which was a hatred of the old system's dogma, is extremely important to the bringing in of the new system, which I think will try to be brought in around 2012, and they're really going to try to put out a lot of propaganda about 2012 because they need people to think this is the beginning of the new enlightenment, when we shed off the old baggage of religion, that wrong religion that was the cause of all this war. There'll probably be a war that will be propagated by people that have the power to do that kind of thing, and they will certainly make sure that the media and everyone else blames it on the Judeo-Christian religions. They have been funding radical Islam in order to use that for the same purpose, to point to it all at the end of all this and say, look at what religion has done. Let's get rid of it. And that will allow for the one thing that I found hard in the Bible to believe, which is that in the future Christians will be outright killed in some politically correct world government. The Christians will be able to be killed. It doesn't make sense. This new system will provide what seems to be a utopia. That's why the Zeitgeist movement is such an obvious part of this, is because that's the kind of thing that's going to be offered to us at the end of this. We will believe as truth seekers that when this happens, that this will all be, done with, that we've defeated the New World Order, and we're offered a grand utopia where the problems of the past are now proven to be false because we've shown some new thing, whatever it may be, aliens, or they'll produce something that will, for a time, make everybody validated in that religion really was false. And now we can just wash our hands of God and begin this new thing without religion and join this new situation. And so it will seem like the Zeitgeistians, like the earliest Christians, don't celebrate Christmas on that day, because it was widely known to be a pagan holiday. And so the early Christians, when they were told several hundred years later that they now had to begin celebrating Jesus' birthday on December 25th, they were very reluctant, because they knew the Bible didn't say anything about it, but they did know that it was an ancient sun worship thing. So they refused, and often were killed for refusing. But remember, the question is, where does it say that Horus was born on December 25th?
Okay, that's not a mistake. That has ancient tradition, and there's a reason for it. It wasn't like there's some calendar issues going on. Calendar's very fascinating. I've been working on a calendar. I'm going to be releasing that soon.
Okay.
The calendar is very fascinating to follow, too. However, when we're talking about the winter solstice, December 25th is fine to acknowledge, because it is part of the winter solstice. It's a 3-day period. Okay, so we have, for Horus, for example, we have this ancient testimony called Plutarch. Plutarch is about as close as we're going to get to a kind of a digest, an encyclopedia. Diodorus Siculus, before that, in the 1st century BC, also lays this out. Herodotus does a little bit, but not quite the same as writing kind of an encyclopedia entry type thing. Otherwise, we don't necessarily have this type of writing going back to these eras before that.
So in other words, she doesn't have any Egyptian claims whatsoever that Horus was born on December 25th. Let me remind everyone that the question posed by the Zeitgeist Challenge website is to show any source before Christ that states any of this stuff. And she here tells us point blank that the best she has is Plutarch, who lived well after the death of Christ. She appeals to him later, and we will discuss Plutarch in greater detail there. In addition, because no one at the time of Plutarch could read hieroglyphics to the best of our knowledge, how is he the authority on the Egyptian view of the birth of Horus? Wouldn't it make more scientific, logical sense to find evidence of this claim about Horus's birth nowadays, with hieroglyphics now being able to be read? Let me tell you, if Acharya knew of any Egyptian reference to Horus being born on December 25th, you can bet that she would be telling us that right now instead of Plutarch. But she appeals to Plutarch here, who, as a priest of Delphi, certainly has his own religious reasons for making these claims. But we'll look into that later.
For one thing,
many of them are emotionally inclined to protect, and that's, of course, one of the sensitive aspects with religion, as you so well know.
It would be illogical for me to suggest that I am not emotionally inclined in some way to protect my beliefs about religion. But I would suggest that both of these individuals are equally emotionally inclined to protect their beliefs about religion, and I would submit very much more so than me or any other Christian. After all, if they are wrong, the consequences are very dire, metaphysically speaking. Not so with me or any other Christian. In addition, both of these speakers' entire professional careers are tied up in their belief that Jesus wasn't real. I assume that they both make money off this idea and have quite a bit emotionally tied to it in that sense, the sense that their belief about religion puts resources on the table. You will hear assertion after assertion by these two that the other side aren't willing to believe them because of their emotions. But I want to make this very clear. I'm only interested in what they say their proof for their claims in the movie Zeitgeist are. I have waited a very long time to hear them. I have offered money to anyone that can produce this evidence. So that's what I want, the evidence.
So what we can do today is begin to expand on a lot of these things that people hear, and they go to an encyclopedia and they say, wait a minute, it doesn't say that in my encyclopedia. And, I mean...
encyclopedia surfing, I call it. Oh.
Yes, exactly. And that's the general nature of most debunkers these days anyway. So I'm looking right now at the Zeitgeist Challenge website, and I'm looking at all the claims that are made by the film that they say basically doesn't exist and they want proof of. So how do you want to do this? For one, I can just basically, Horus, for example. We have Horus born on December 25th, which most people don't seem to understand that we're talking about the winter solstice more than anything else. Would you expand on the birth of Horus? And you can go in whatever direction you like as far as these points.
Sure. Let me explain a couple of things about how the historical process and scholarship work. First of all, not everything makes it into the dictionary or the encyclopedia. Okay? Sure. Encyclopedia surfing is completely inadequate. These things have been censored. These are talk about short digests.
Right.
I mean, this is just a few paragraphs on a subject, and they don't put in the stuff that's going to upset the status quo. Okay?
Yeah.
This stuff has been edited out. There was something called the Inquisition. Ever heard of it? They destroyed thousands and thousands of books for the very purpose that we're talking about now, that this information is not in those books because they didn't want it in there. So I had to dig up this stuff. Some of this stuff is barely even translated into English. If you go to Christ in Egypt, you'll find some translations for the first time into English.
Right.
I had to dig up stuff that was in German, handwritten German. It was extremely difficult. On this specific issue, in fact, the December 25th, or rather the winter solstice celebration in ancient Egypt, you'll see people go, oh, well, I've actually seen Egyptologists have read where they said there doesn't seem to be any winter solstice acknowledgement in Egypt. And I'm going, well, yeah, there certainly is. Here are a bunch of hieroglyphs.
Remember, the question that she's been asked is, where does it say that Horus was born on December 25th, which is the first question on the Zeitgeist Challenge website. But 2 points really quick. She immediately appeals to the idea that the main reason this isn't obvious to other scholars, except for her, is because of a truly massive Christian conspiracy, where Christians destroyed all pagan references that conflicted with their religion. I would like to point out, as I did in the first refutation of her defending of Zeitgeist, that she should produce a logical reason why she thinks that during this time when Christians were being crucified and burned alive for refusing to deny Christ by the Roman Empire, that same Roman Empire gave them some kind of authority to march into temples and homes of pagans and steal and destroy their literature. And if they want to say it's because the Roman Church later, and about 400 years later, decided to go back and destroy all the evidence that conflicted with it, you still have the problem of them or anyone else not knowing what the Egyptian hieroglyphics said at that point, only having been recently been able to be interpreted, and therefore wouldn't be a target of any rampaging Christians because they would have no idea which hieroglyphics said what about Horus being born on December 25th or being crucified, etc. So you should have this pristine record of Horus being born on December 25th or being crucified and all these other things in Egyptian writings. And I'm even willing to say that they might have to be interpreted in such a way to produce that. But nevertheless, there should be a full body of evidence in that regard to this day that would not have been a target of the Catholic Church or rampaging Christians. Why even appeal to this argument if you have solid evidence to prove the initial claim in the first place? Why even say, well, first, before we get started here, I just want you to know that all the evidence was destroyed. But keep in mind, the question here that she's been asked is, where does it say in the Egyptian writings, preferably, but really any other writing before 33 AD, that Horus was said to be born on December 25th? That is the question.
In fact, they include in the book the hieroglyph for the winter solstice. It shows the goddesses Isis and Nephthys on either side of the sun, holding like a baby sun over an ankh, giving life to the sun. This is the hieroglyph for the winter solstice. So they have this beautiful hieroglyph, in fact, to describe the winter solstice. The winter solstice was extremely important in ancient Egypt. There are many buildings aligned to the winter solstice. The Temple of Luxor, I believe, is one. There are, in fact, here's where, when you're talking about the December 25th birthday, okay, now, first of all, why that day and it's not the 21st, 22nd? That needs to be explained, too. There's a 3-day period, a trigium or a trigium, that the ancients recognized that at that point it seemed like for 3 days the sun was not moving either south or north. This is from a geocentric perspective. That it was dead in a tomb, so to speak, because that's where it seemed to be going, into the tomb. It was going to die. This is towards the winter solstice when everything is the days are getting shorter and shorter. And so there seemed to be there's this 3-day period where the sun on the sundial seemed to be not moving at all, and the sun was dead. So they said that it stopped. Solstice means sun stops. Sun stops moving. So the solstice, the sun stopped for 3 days, and then it was born again, and it would be, the 24th at midnight, basically. So that's why we have this Christmas Eve thing going on. So it's not a mistake to say that the sun was born again on the 25th.
No one is really arguing any of those points. The question is in regard to Horus's birth. It is, of course, incredibly noteworthy at this point to point out that Jesus was emphatically not born on December 25th. Even from a purely literary perspective, no ancient text that I'm aware of ever refers to a birth for Jesus on that day or any other day, and that the holiday was constructed several hundred years later, and it was actually based on ancient pagan practices that were established by Rome's version of Christianity in order to appease the pagans in Rome. This is why many Christians... Hi, my name is Chris White from ZeitgeistChallenge.com. I'm here to comment on a recent interview from Peter Joseph. He is the director of the movie Zeitgeist, and Acharya S, who he's interviewing, who was the consultant for part 1 of the movie. She was also cited over 31 times under different names by Zeitgeist for some of the most controversial claims of the movie. It comes out in the interview that Joseph asked Acharya to write a short ebook called the Real Zeitgeist Challenge to attempt to respond to the website that Frank Lordy and I have put up, called ZeitgeistChallenge.com. The book also directly quotes from me and a previous video that I did analyzing Acharya's first such response to critics asking her where she got her information that was used so prominently in the film Zeitgeist the Movie, and I will link that here in the description section. You will note that through this interview it appears that Joseph brought her on the show to answer word for word the challenge that is posted on the Zeitgeist Challenge website. It seems apparent that Joseph thought that she would have the answers to some of those questions. After all, she did claim these things to be true in her books, and Joseph has already endorsed Acharya's work to a generation of truth seekers with his movie. And you'll notice very quickly that the answers that she gives are not too convincing. So let's take a look at this discourse, and I want you all, no matter what side of the fence you are on, to listen to this discussion. This is supposed to be the answer to the critics. This is the big game. Acharya S., the consultant for the movie, and Peter Joseph, the director, are about to try to answer all the big questions that the debunkers have been asking. So keep an open mind and decide which one of us has a more compelling argument. Also, please note that I will be editing the audio slightly because of time constraint purposes, but I will not leave out any information that is vital or helpful in any way to their case, and I will link the full interview for your review in the description section. Okay, so let's get started. Here's our host, Peter Joseph and Acharya S.
As you know, debunkers will go after every tiny little thing without doing any research. I believe that's the game of debunkers, is semantic manipulation and fragmentation, from what I understand. I know that you've had your experience with that as well.
Well said. Yes, it's a never-ending game, and it seems to be a game with no rules except on their side.
Yeah, well, they're making the rules, evidently.
Yeah, changing the way we do research.
Yes, precisely. And when it comes to
acceptable.
Yes, and when it comes to well, also to fit their worldviews, that